A Room of One's Own is not the first book by Virginia Woolf which I've read. The first book I read was actually, well, not really a full book, but a short story called The Death of a Moth, and I read that 2 years ago. I wasn't very impressed with it. Maybe it wasn't really the best short story of hers to start with. It's one of her most famous. I mean, I didn't dislike it, I just wasn't particularly impressed, but I've heard so many good things about A Room of One's Own from other bloggers who I follow and whose opinion I trust, so I was excited to read it and sort of read something new. I have not really delved into Virginia Woolf's writing. Based on what I read in this book, I think I will definitely be seeking out some of her novels in the future. I was looking at Virginia Woolf's biography online, and there's just so much you could say about her that I don't think it's easily summed up in 3 bullet points, so I'll try to sum it up here in 5. So, first thing you should know about her is she was born in 1882, approaching the end of the Victorian era. She was born into a large blended family. Both her parents had been widowed before. Virginia Woolf would later write about her home life in various books. At one point, she actually wrote that she had been sexually abused by her 2 stepbrothers who were more than 10 years older than her. And if that's so, then it could be related to why she suffered from chronic depression and mental health struggles her whole life. Another thing that is widely known about her early life is she was educated at home as a child by both of her parents. This was while her brothers were sent to schools, and she did go on to take some classes at King's College as a young woman, but for the most part we can think of her as being self-educated. Her father was an author himself and also famous as an alpine mountaineer, and he had connections with literary circles and famous authors, so Virginia Woolf actually was sort of in that circle from a young age, and she did start writing at a pretty young age, and she met people like Thomas Hardy. So the world of authorship was not really new to her. She was pretty much born into it, which is kind of unusual for an author. When she got older, Virginia Woolf joined this group called the Bloomsbury Group, and it was just a circle of friends who lived in the Bloomsbury area of London. They subscribed to a bohemian, or what we would call eccentric lifestyle, I guess. The Bloomsburys included other well-known figures such as John Maynard Keynes, who founded Keynesianism, and also E.M. Forster, who wrote A Passage to India and A Room with a View. So that novel of Forster's having a little bit of similarity to Virginia Woolf's book, A Room of One's Own. And actually, thematically, there are some similarities between the 2 books. Virginia Woolf went on to write a number of novels and many short stories and many essays. She is most well known, I would say, for having a stream of consciousness style. So her book, if you opened it, it would just sort of read like someone was writing down their thoughts as they came to them. Her books also feature themes of gender and sexuality. She was married to Leonard Woolf, another Bloomsbury member, but she was also involved with another female novelist. Virginia Woolf is also considered to be a feminist author and sort of one of the feminist figures of the early 20th century. I mentioned earlier that she suffered from mental health issues throughout her life. In 1941, she was 59 and she drowned herself. It was not her first suicide attempt, and in her note she left to her husband, she described herself as going mad. There's a number of theories about why she committed suicide. One of the reasons may have been to do with World War II and the effects it left upon her. There's a lot you can read about that. I just wanted to summarize her life so you'd get an idea of who is writing this book and why their perspective is the way it is. I think this lends a lot of clues to A Room of One's Own. This book is a sort of modified form of some lectures which Virginia Woolf gave to female colleges at Cambridge University. I think this compilation, if you will, was either published or written in 1928. And the frame story actually takes place, in part, at a fictional college. She calls it Oxbridge. But basically, she starts out the book guiding you through her own tour of Oxbridge and how she's sort of impressed with this sensation that everywhere she turns, Oxbridge is very much a male-dominated college and sort of its own culture, if you will. For example, she's told she cannot visit the library without a male guide or a letter of introduction. And, when she approaches every building, she starts to wonder, well, will I be allowed in, or will I need a male guide to be allowed into this building? So that's kind of how this very conversational book starts out. And it's interesting because she doesn't take a highly offended tone at all. She's sort of guiding you through her experiences and telling you about them in an observational way, which is well geared towards someone who doesn't consider themselves a feminist. So she talks about her visit to Oxbridge, including the meals. There's some moments of humor here. She talks about the lunch at Oxbridge, which she says was full of good food and post-war conversation. So not so much that people were saying different things, but she felt like there was a difference about the tone of conversation compared to how people would talk before the war. And she does sprinkle allusions to World War I throughout the book, which I found very interesting. And then she talks about dinner at Oxbridge, which is bad food in her book. She describes it as stringy beef, custard, and prunes. And after this, she starts to have sort of a bad feeling about the place, which she sees sort of symbolized by things that happened earlier in the day, but sort of are culminating in this bad dinner, particularly to do with the prunes. Sometime later, she visits the British Museum, and she has been tasked with giving, this lecture about women and fiction. So she goes to the British Museum and looks for books about this topic. What she finds are many books about women, but they're written by men. And she asks herself, why are women so much more interesting to men than men are to women? And as she's poring over these books and sort of getting an idea of what men have said about women throughout history, she comes to a few conclusions. And I'm going to go over 3 of these conclusions or ideas. And I will say that I'm not able to go into everything in depth, but I just want to hit the highlights. The first thing that comes to her attention or to her notice is this idea that men have used women to feel superior. They've used women as mirrors to their ego, and for examples, she cites Napoleon and Mussolini. You can read about the Napoleonic Code and how, in spite of the movement for liberty and equality and rights, women's rights did not particularly improve during the Napoleonic era. In fact, and here I quote Encyclopedia Britannica, it says, "The code subordinated women to their fathers and husbands, who controlled all family property, determined the fate of children, and were favored in divorce proceedings." So that, in a nutshell, is kind of what the Napoleonic Code, the new code of law, resulted in for women during that time. And she talks about other books in a very euphemistic way. She doesn't really call out a lot of names, except for some of the more famous ones, which everyone has read. But sort of as a summary of what she finds on the shelf, she describes this imaginary book, which is kind of a compilation of the ideas she keeps coming across, and she would describe the title as, quote, "The Mental, Moral, and Physical Inferiority of the Female Sex." And this book is by an imaginary author named Professor Von X. She starts to have this sort of picture of him in her mind as this ugly and angry old man who rails against women and is still unhappy with the way things are. I suppose her reason for leaving specific books and names out was so that she wouldn't get sued or whatever. But I would be curious to know exactly which books she was talking about and, If you happen to know what books she was really citing, I would love to know. I did a little bit of searching, but I didn't find anything immediately which was suggested as being the source for these angry men, basically. And it segues into the next thing, which she sort of concludes, and I summarize it very succinctly, I guess, as feminists should ideally not be angry. And what happens here is Woolf, as she pictures this Professor Von X, she finds herself getting angry, and she views it as a reaction to the tone of these books that she's reading. These sort of very emotions-based books, and not really supported by facts. And she says she would accept facts if facts were being presented to her, but she thinks that it's very much emotional, and there's just not something solid behind it, and so that kind of makes her have an emotional reaction to it. In the middle of this exploration of these negative emotions that she finds herself experiencing, she starts to talk about women writers through history, and here is where she references Austen and the Brontë sisters. Now, she praises Jane Austen for sort of a cool-headed approach, essentially writing that's not too self-conscious and not angry. And she also praises Emily Brontë for a sort of a rawness to her writing, which Virginia Woolf thinks very highly of. And she also criticizes Charlotte Brontë for showing anger and frustration in Jane Eyre, because there's a scene in Jane Eyre where Jane is talking about the injustice of her situation. Virginia Woolf feels like Charlotte would have been a stronger writer if she had suppressed that anger in the book and just left it out, just like stuck to the story, I guess. And I kind of see both sides here, having read Jane Eyre and Villette and other books by Charlotte Brontë. I don't know how you could write a book about true injustice and not show some emotion. In Jane Eyre's case, her own protectors when she was a child were abusive to her, and she had nothing and no one else. So I don't really see a sort of cool-headed approach to Jane Eyre, or even like skipping over that whole emotional journey she went through. I think that's actually the strength of the book. I just can't see Jane Eyre without that element. And also, I think that to not show any kind of weakness is not realistic either, because, most of us have some kind of reaction to when things go wrong or when people are not fair. From a contemporary perspective, I definitely see Woolf's point. In hindsight, it seems like a calm approach is generally the best way to drive your point home, to bring about some kind of change or to persuade people. And I know a lot of people value Jane Austen very highly for her more measured approach. And you watch any movie these days, and the filmmaker's attempts to portray strong female characters is often very silly and cartoonish, and it just doesn't ring terribly true. I mean, it's almost like mirroring the ego that Virginia Woolf was talking about. It's just not a very positive way to approach the problem. So I can see both sides here. I don't really agree that Jane Austen is a stronger author. I've always favored Charlotte Brontë myself, to be honest. But I definitely see both sides of this coin, and I do think there is sort of a need for both to a certain extent. But moving on to the third thing which Virginia Woolf focuses on in this book, and that is the progress of women throughout history, particularly in the realm of writing fiction or producing any kind of art. And her conclusion is that women need money to live on, to be independent, and having a space, a room of their own to produce that art. So she talks about the Elizabethan times and how women were often married off at a very young age. And she speculates, what if Shakespeare had had a poet sister named Judith? And as she sort of follows that mentally, she thinks that Judith's story would not have gone well. I would just sort of counter that by asking, well, what about Anne Bradstreet, the 17th century Puritan poet who wrote poetry in America? What about someone like her who clearly did write and have a successful portfolio in spite of her surroundings and the kind of pushback she got from people? And what about Emily Dickinson, who wrote poetry and was a contemporary of the Brontes? I feel like Woolf's book would have been much more well-rounded if she had included these American examples of women who did write poetry in spite of their surroundings. And as we talked about a week or two ago, Emily Dickinson had a pretty good education and a pretty good environment in which to write poetry. So I think that would have been a good thing to bring up here, but Woolf focuses mostly on English history and does not particularly find many great examples except for a few lesser-known names which she calls out, like Fanny Burney and women who predated more famous authors, and she said we should remember those women as having paved the way. So that was her thesis, if you will. A couple of more points she touched upon were her belief in mental differences between men and women, and also a belief that the brain is sort of divided into masculine and feminine, and that was kind of an interesting aside. And she also talked about wars as providing opportunities for women to get new types of jobs, such as Florence Nightingale in the Crimean War, and also the new jobs that came up for women after World War I in 1918. I'm not going to go deeply into those topics, but I thought they were something to think about. But most importantly, I found that Virginia Woolf does not devalue motherhood in this book, and I think that is really one of the strengths of this series of lectures. She references more than once her admiration for women who raise children, and she suggests that Jane Austen really did find the world even in her shared sitting room, which wasn't a room of her own, but she nonetheless was able to develop a special understanding of human nature from just meeting people in that room, which she shared with other people. So I thought that was a really neat point to make. This book is not just for feminists. It's sort of a combination of history and philosophy and a lot of questions, which some of them she tries to answer and some are just sort of she throws out there. I found it to be quite an interesting book. I definitely didn't agree with her on everything, and there were some things I didn't necessarily care for in terms of her viewpoint on things, but I think it reminds us of how much we've gained over the past 100 years. There's a lot of food for thought in this book, a lot to remind you to be grateful of, and it is a book I will revisit in the future for sure. I wanted to end with this quote from the book, and it ties into a question I've asked before, and that's, what is a classic? What qualifies as a classic? And it goes, masterpieces are not single and solitary births. They are the outcome of many years of thinking in common, of thinking by the body of the people, so that the experience of the mass is behind the single voice. I think that not only is that a great description of a masterpiece, I think that is a good way to approach books to see if they're a classic. It goes back to universal themes and the fact that a book can draw many people in from different backgrounds, but I really liked that quote. It kind of puts another spin on it. The idea that when you're writing, you're not just writing from your own isolated life. You're writing from a perspective that has been accumulated over years and is the result of many influences, not just yourself. So I think that's a great point to make. I hope that I will read many more books that fall under that category and be able to share them with you in the future.